Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're tackling a really heavy word, one you hear constantly, fascism.
Yeah, it gets thrown around a lot.
It does. People point to figures like Bolsonaro or Trump, and the label fascist comes out fast.
Right.
And sometimes, as our sources point out, it feels like it's just become simply a term of abuse for any politician people don't like, which isn't very helpful, is it?
No, it's really not. And that's the core problem if you want actual clarity. The sources we're looking at today, they stress that, to understand and maybe even combat an ideological threat, you need a precise diagnosis first.
Like a doctor diagnosing a disease.
Exactly. These analyses, they come mainly from Leon Trotsky's historical work and related Marxist writings. They're pushing for a scientific view, a really sober appraisal of what classical fascism actually was.
Okay, so that's our task for this deep dive. Let's really unpack it. The mission for you listening is to leave with a clear, analytical understanding. We'll define it, look at its history.
And then apply that definition to see what the sources say about the threat today.
Right. So let's start with that classical definition, because the first thing that jumps out from the sources is that fascism is seen as fundamentally different from just, standard right-wing reaction. What's the key distinction there?
Well, it comes down to who's doing the reacting and what their immediate goal is. Traditional reaction, think maybe a military coup or something, that usually involves a pretty small layer. The existing state powers, generals, police chiefs, the bureaucracy.
Okay, so it's sort of top-down within the existing system.
More or less, yeah. It's an internal shift. But fascism, as Trotsky saw it taking shape back in the 1920s in Italy and Germany, that was based on a genuine mass movement.
A mass movement, not just the elites.
No, that's the critical difference. It wasn't the ruling class directly, but a movement built from what the sources call the frenzied middle class and declassed layers.
Okay, frenzied middle class and declassed layers. We should probably unpack that jargon a bit.
Yeah.
Who exactly are we talking about here?
It's important context. So middle class here isn't like, comfortable suburban professionals today. Think more like small shopkeepers on the brink of bankruptcy, farmers losing their land, maybe veterans who came back from war totally disillusioned, small business owners getting squeezed out.
People caught in the middle, economically speaking.
Exactly. Caught between big capital and the organized labor movement. And the D-class layers, those are people who've lost their social footing entirely. Desperate, angry, feeling like no one represents them. Fascism really tapped into that desperation.
Okay, that clarifies the who. Now, what about the what? The sources define fascism's ultimate goal as the destruction of all forms of working-class organization. That sounds incredibly specific.
It is very specific. Annihilating trade unions, workers' political parties, any independent group where workers could organize their power. That's the core aim, according to this analysis.
So it's laser-focused on crushing organized labor specifically. What about other groups? We know fascists historically targeted ethnic minorities, religious groups.
Absolutely, and that's crucial. Fascism is always deeply racist, anti-Semitic, xenophobic. Those groups are immediate victims. But the sources, coming from that Marxist viewpoint, argue the structural goal, the thing that allows fascism to stabilize capitalism in crisis, is destroying the organized working class, because that's seen as the only force capable of fundamentally challenging the system.
So attacking minorities might be part of the mobilization, but dismantling worker power is the strategic objective.
That's the argument presented, yes. It's seen as the necessary step to impose total control for the ruling class when things get really unstable.
And the sources are pretty blunt about how this became possible historically.
They are. They argue fascism only triumphed in Italy, Germany, Spain after serious defeats of the socialist revolutions in those places.
Defeats caused by.
Well, the analysis blames the mistakes or treachery of the reformist and Stalinist leaders, essentially internal political failures within the workers' movement itself. Things like not uniting different factions against the fascists or making bad strategic choices that demoralize their own pace.
So a failure of leadership opened the door.
That's the core argument. Lost opportunities allowed fascism to grow and ultimately take power.
Okay, let's pivot from the definition to the actual history.
Mm-hmm.
This is where it gets really concrete. Italy, under Mussolini, for instance. Marie Frederickson's analysis looks at what happened to unions there.
Right. It's a fascinating case study in control. So after Mussolini took power, technically, trade unions still existed on paper.
But they weren't real unions.
Not in any meaningful sense, no. The sources stress they were completely state-run, basically hollowed-out shells turned into instruments of the fascist state to control workers, not represent them.
Why?
But what's really interesting strategically is that the sources note communists still managed to work inside these fake unions. They had to be incredibly careful, obviously,
Hmm.
but they used these structures, these instruments, as a way to organize opposition from within.
That's a complex picture. Now, contrast that with Nazi Germany. Hitler's rise seems different. There's that chilling quote from Hans-Gerd Oeffinger.
Yeah, Effinger points out that Hitler came to power without so much as breaking a pane of glass.
How is that even possible?
Well, it goes back to those earlier defeats. The working class organizations, the potential resistance, had already been weakened, divided, and politically disarmed by the failures of their leadership in the preceding years.
So the path was cleared.
Essentially, there's a book title mentioned in the sources that sums up that era starkly. Germany, 1918-1933, Socialism or Barbarism. The argument is the failure to achieve the first led directly to the second.
And that theme of leadership failure comes up again with Spain, right? Franco's uprising.
Absolutely. Franco launched his coup on July 18, 1936, and the timing is key. It happened precisely when the Spanish ruling class felt they couldn't control the situation through normal democratic means anymore.
Because the workers' movement was getting too strong.
Exactly. They faced this growing, powerful movement from below. When that challenge became existential for them, they resorted to the most extreme option: mobilizing a fascist counter-revolution. The sources argue the Spanish Civil War demonstrates the importance of leadership again, but in a negative sense, meaning leadership mistakes on the Republican side contributed significantly to their eventual defeat.
It's a grim picture of how fascism took hold. But of course, it was eventually defeated militarily in World War II. The sources mention Stalingrad.
Yes, and that's vital context. If the political failures of the 20s and 30s let fascism rise, the Battle of Stalingrad, the 70th anniversary was noted, was a key turning point in its destruction.
A brutal, massive battle.
Immense. The Soviet Union managed to defeat the Nazis there, shattering the German Sixth Army. It came at an incredible human cost, hundreds of thousands of lives. But it marked the beginning of the end for Nazi military power on the Eastern Front. It really underlines the catastrophic price paid for not stopping fascism earlier, when it was weaker.
That historical cost really frames the next question. If we take this very strict classical definition we've been discussing, how does it apply today? The sources seem quite cautious about labeling current figures.
They really urge caution, yes. They warn against scaremongering and exaggeration when people sound the alarm about figures like Donald Trump or Marine Le Pen.
So why the distinction? What makes them different from Hitler or Mussolini in this analysis?
Well, Murray Fredrickson puts it directly. Figures like Trump and Le Pen differ from genuinely fascist leaders and movement. The argument is, while they're definitely right-wing, often reactionary, sometimes racist and authoritarian, they aren't, at least currently, doing that specific thing classical fascism did. They aren't organizing and mobilizing that same kind of frenzied mass base outside the state with the explicit immediate goal of physically annihilating all worker organizations.
So they operate more within the existing political system even if they strain it?
Largely, yes. Their power base and methods are different. They use existing state levers, elections, media manipulation, rather than primarily relying on building paramilitary street movements aimed at crushing unions and left parties from the outside, which was the hallmark of classical fascism.
Okay, so based on that very specific definition, what's the actual assessment of a return to classical fascism today?
According to these sources, the prospect is judged to be very small indeed.
Very small. Why so definitive?
Two main structural reasons are given. First, the working class today is just enormously stronger than it was in the 1920s or 30s.
How numerically? Organizationally?
Both, really. It's larger globally, more concentrated in big workplaces and cities. It potentially wields much more economic power through its position in production and logistics than the more fragmented working class of that earlier era.
Okay, that's a major shift in the balance of forces. What's the second reason?
The second reason is that fascism's classic social reserves have shrunk.
You mean that frenzied middle class?
Exactly. That base of small shopkeepers, independent farmers, small artisans, the petty bourgeoisie. Modern capitalism, with its huge corporations and consolidation, has reduced the size and political weight of that layer significantly. There are fewer of those desperate independent producers who could form the backbone of that specific kind of anti-worker mass movement.
So the social ingredients aren't really there in the same way.
That's the argument. The specific conditions that fueled Hitler or Mussolini's rise are less prevalent, but there's a big but.
I figured there would be.
The sources add a crucial warning. Classical fascism could only stage a comeback following a series of serious defeats of the working class.
So it's still a potential danger, but only if the labor movement suffers massive setbacks first.
Precisely. The system, the argument goes, only resorts to that absolute extreme measure when all other forms of control have failed, when democracy can no longer contain the situation, and the working class is powerful, but then suffers devastating defeats. It's the option of last resort for capitalism in deep crisis.
Okay, so if the threat of full-blown classical fascism returning is low right now, what about the smaller groups? The sources mention groups like the English Defence League, the British National Party, actual self-proclaimed fascist or neo-fascist grouplets. What's the approach there?
On this, the sources are completely unambiguous. These small groups must be combated by the working class directly.
Combated how? Protests, debates.
The analysis points to historical examples, specifically the Battle of Cable Street in London, October 4th, 1936. The 75th anniversary was noted in the material.
Right, where Mosley's black shirts were stopped from marching through the East End?
Exactly. It's described as a momentous event where ordinary working people, dockers, tailors, local residents, socialists, communists, Jewish groups physically united and blocked the streets. They delivered a decisive blow against the menace British fascism through mass mobilization.
So the lesson is direct confrontation.
That's the clear implication, the need to physically prevent these groups from organizing and intimidating communities. Referencing the horrific attack in Norway on the Labour Party youth camp, the analysis uses the phrase, face hard with hard. There's a mandate for organized, physical opposition to prevent these groups from gaining any ground.
It seems the core takeaway here is about clarity. Understanding the precise definition of fascism helps focus energy correctly. Don't mislabel every opponent.
Because that actually weakens your ability to recognize and fight the real thing if and when it actually appears. Knowing the difference helps tailor the strategy.
Right. Call everything fascism and the word loses its specific, terrifying meaning.
Exactly.
Okay, we've covered a lot of ground. We've defined classical fascism as that specific mass movement aimed at destroying worker organizations. We looked at how its historical victories were linked to defeats for socialists, and we've seen why the sources assess the current threat of classical fascism as low due to changes in class structure, even while acknowledging the rise of other reactionary forces.
Yeah, it's been a deep dive, and I want to leave you, the listener, with one final thought. It connects back to those political complexities and failures of the 1930s, and maybe some cynicism involved.
Wow.
The sources remind us that capitalism, historically, has shown a predatory nature and a real capacity for violent suppression when its power is challenged. History isn't always clean ideological battles. Sometimes alliances get very strange. The Stalin-Hitler Pact, signed August 24th, 70 years before some of our source material was written, called an incredible event in the text. This non-aggression treaty between Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union.
Right.
It wasn't just about not fighting each other.
It had secret protocols, didn't it?
It did. Secret protocols that basically carved up Poland between them and divided Eastern Europe into German and Soviet spheres of influence. It was a staggering act of geopolitical maneuvering that gave Hitler a green light, temporarily, to attack Poland and focus on the West without fearing a two-front war immediately.
A pact that gave fascism breathing room.
Significant strategic latitude, yes. So, the final thought for you today is this. What specific geopolitical and human prices were paid in terms of invasions, occupations, atrocities for that non-aggression pact? What were the immediate consequences of this deal that allowed fascism that temporary strategic freedom?
Something for listeners to research further. The complexities of history.
Exactly. Dig into the details of that pact and what happened right after. It's a sobering lesson.